Hello and welcome to the Rogue Monkey podcast, the show that shares insightful stories to motivate, inspire, and support you following your own dreams through both work and life. We encourage our listeners to shoot for the stars, and today's interview is very much akin to that. Today I'm joined by Rob, the co-founder of Braided Communications, a tool that's been developed to support the well-being of astronauts on future Mars missions and beyond, to overcome the significant time delays with communications in deep space. Now, how I stumbled across this story and how the project has come to be is absolutely incredible. It's a mind-bending conversation, and to give you a glimmer of what's to come, Rob is an astrophysicist who, with his co-founder, conceptualised and then created a solution to long-distance communication in space. The development of that solution is currently being supported by the UK Space Agency, the European Space Agency and NASA. Now, I'm not going to say much more than that, as the journey that Rob takes us on is fascinating. Just before I start, if I can ask that you give us a quick subscribe on whatever platform you're joining us on today, so you don't miss out on any future episodes. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please make sure you give it a share with someone that you think would enjoy it. Right, let's get into our conversation and episode 69 of the Rogue Monkey podcast. Earth to Mars, over, the story of Braided Communications. Hello, Rob, and welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Very good. How are you?
Yeah, excellent. Been excited about recording this one for a long time. We connected 7-8 months ago now, believe it or not, by sheer chance. And we've ended up sitting here chatting on a podcast. So do you fancy giving our listeners and viewers out there just, a quick introduction as to who you are and your background?
Yeah, happy to. So thanks. Yeah, and it was a strange way of meeting because we started by chatting on a train completely by chance. So yeah, one of those odd moments, but that was a great conversation and really looking forward to this one. So my background is I always been a science nerd. I love science. I ended up going to university and studying astrophysics, which I really loved. But I never had any intention of becoming an academic. I always wanted to go into proper work, if you like, if that's the way of saying it. I ended up after university going off traveling. I've got a huge passion for traveling, always have had since I've been able to travel. And I ended up traveling around the world and finding places where I kept running into this old company called Cable and Wireless, which was the old British Empire telephone company. And when I came back, they were looking for people to join them. And they said, we'll send you overseas to work. So I ended up going into telecoms without any planning at all, purely because it was a great way of getting me to go and work overseas, which I did. End up living in Hong Kong and absolutely loved it for a while. Spent a long time in telecoms, but always had a sort of a passion for the scientific side. So even though I was on the sales and the commercial side, I was always the one talking to the engineers about how we could play with their engineering toys and make new products out of them and stuff like that. So that's where I sort of spent the beginning of my career. In telecoms, building on a bit of science background and a little bit of sort of sales and marketing background. Eventually, sometimes it was planned, sometimes it wasn't, but eventually, partly planned, partly not planned, I ended up moving into a field called digital health when it first started. So it's pretty big now, and it's grown massively during the pandemic. The ability to help people to take care of themselves by measuring vital signs remotely and sending that information into a clinician who can then interpret it and advise the patient or the person. So I've been doing that for a good number of years in both physical health and mental health. And along the way there, I met my co-founder in Braided Communications, Drew, and we started the journey we're on now.
So there's a lot to unpick there. And one of the things that's really curious, especially obviously knowing where we're going to go with this conversation, this passion for almost exploration and going places, if you like. What was your earliest memory of actually kind of that becoming a thing, if you like, of actually going, I really want to go out there and explore, let's call it explore the world, but actually just that nature of going out and going to different places and trying new things?
So good. So I don't know why, but I've always had it in me that I wanted to do that. And when I was a kid, we never did. We went on holidays to fantastic places like Cornwall and Wales and places like that, in windswept caravan parks and campsites, and they were great. But we never really went overseas. I think before I went to university, the only place we'd ever been was over to Sweden, actually, because my mum had a pen friend from when she was a child, and that was the only foreign holiday we had. But I always wanted to travel. So after university, I worked at home for a year, saved some cash, and then went off for a year's traveling. So actually, the first time I got on a plane, it was on my own to Miami Airport, which was a little bit daunting because I'd never been through an airport. I didn't really know what I was doing, and ended up landing in Miami at the beginning of a year, traveling and working around the world. So I've always wanted to do that. It's a bit daunting, but it's hugely exciting. You meet so many different people if you throw yourself into it. As you meet different people, you learn different things, you have different experiences, you see some fantastic places, you have some fantastic times, you have some pretty ropey times as well, and you learn a lot from that. So I don't know where it came from, but it's always been there.
And I think it's something that I've talked about, I guess, with guests previously, is that often you go down roads that you're not necessarily sure where you're heading, but you know that's the direction you sort of want to head in. And I think too often it's people like having everything planned out meticulously, and actually life isn't like that. And almost the people that can adapt and evolve and take opportunities when they emerge are the ones that perhaps end up in seats like you're in now. So I'm really curious as to this transition kind of leading up to, I guess, pre-Braided Communications, from first discussion, idea, concept, any thought around potentially the problem that you're going to go on to solve, all the way through to actually where you are now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, an interesting sort of aside on that is, one of the things I've said a few times over the years is I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. And I thought I did a few times, and then stuff happens and takes you down different paths. So the move from telecoms to digital health was very much one that just sort of happened, but I absolutely loved it. I really got a lot out of being that, and that's what led into Braided. So the story in the background of Braided is I was working in a mental health care company. So we were providing online cognitive behavioral therapy to people, working with the NHS, and we had a therapist. He was a part-time therapist working for us up in Scotland, and with some relationships he had and some relationships I built, we were starting to get some inroads to support patients in Scotland, where we'd never worked before. We'd all done all our work in England. So we were basically pursuing that opportunity. So I was up in Scotland a couple of times with him. His name's Drew. He's my co-founder in Braided now. And we were going to some pretty remote places in Scotland. So one of them was the Western Isles. We were in Stornoway, which isn't that remote on a sort of the big scheme of things, but it kind of is from a UK point of view. And we were up there, and we basically shook hands on a deal with the NHS in that part of Scotland to deploy our services. So that was fantastic. And I was obviously very happy, because being UK MD of the company, that was another customer contract. So that was fantastic. Stornoway, you have to sort of wait for the next flight out. There's not like flights every half an hour, whatever. So we had plenty of time to sort of spend time thinking ahead of leaving. And I got back to the airport, and Drew was at the airport, and he wasn't looking as happy as I was. And I was like, "Hey, what's up? We've just done a deal. This is fantastic." And he was just scribbling some stuff on this piece of paper. And I looked at it, and with my background in astrophysics, it seemed like he was drawing the orbits of planets and trying to think about what, something like that. And I was like, "Why is he doing this?" So I asked him, "What's this?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just trying to do some sort of some maths." And I looked at it, and with my background, I was able to. I said, "I understand what you're doing here." I could start to answer the question. Couldn't finish answering the question because it was a long time ago that I did my degree, but I was able to start it. And we had this weird conversation where Drew said, "Oh, wow, you know some of this stuff." He said, I've been looking for an astrophysicist for quite a while to chat about this." And of course, I started laughing because I am an astrophysicist. More importantly, everyone in the company knew I was an astrophysicist, because it's a bit weird having someone who's an astrophysicist running that kind of company. So it was kind of on the website and everyone knew. Turned out Drew hadn't bothered reading the website of the company that was paying him money. So he didn't know that at all. So we had that strange conversation. I said, "Look, I can help you with this. I need to probably go back and look at some books and maybe even ask an old mate or two. But why are you doing it?" And he's like, oh, it's just something I'm working on the side. Well, fair enough. Entitled to do that. That's fine because you're a part-timer. I was really curious though. It's like, why is he thinking about this? And then a few weeks later, I was back up again to explore more of this sort of Scottish opportunity. And I asked him in more detail, and he said, oh, I'll tell you, but it's just a crazy idea. So please, keep it quiet. I said, of course. By this time we were pretty good friends, having spent so long together. So he told me this idea, and he said that he'd started thinking about when humans go to Mars. There's lots of challenges when humans eventually go to Mars, which obviously hopefully will happen sometime in the next 15, 20 years, whatever. Some obvious challenges around, you have to have a rocket, you have to be able to recycle water, etc. But he's a psychotherapist and he's got a specialism in emotional attachment. So he came at it in a slightly different viewpoint. And he thought, when you send people away to Mars, they can't communicate back to Earth in the same way they do today. The way we're talking now, I say something, you hear me straight away. If you were on Mars, it might take, depending on where Mars and Earth are, it might take 5, 10, even 20 minutes for my voice to reach you, and equally the same time for your reply to reach me. So you can't have a normal conversation. It's fairly basic physics. Everyone's known this for a long, long time. And operationally, you start to think, well, that means the people going on these deep space missions are going to need to be much more self-sufficient than the people who are going around the Earth on the International Space Station, which is much closer. So operationally, you can think about how you would deal with it. But he thought, from a human being point of view, if you're in that spaceship and you can't talk to your mother, your brother, your partner or whatever, that is actually really bad for you psychologically, and then really bad for you physiologically as well. So in simple terms, you will become unwell and you will stop functioning as a normal human being if you can't rely on the same emotional connections as you have normally. So he thought, well, these clever people at NASA must have solved that problem, because they couldn't possibly even consider planning a trip to Mars without solving that problem. I wonder how they've done it though, because he knew enough about physics to know it wasn't possible because of the speed of light not being capable of being broken, etc. So he just went and did a bit of digging out of pure interest, and he found out that they hadn't solved that problem. They knew it was an issue. They thought about it mainly operationally rather than psychologically, but they just said, well, we can't fix that, so we're kind of going to ignore it, and we're going to, if you dig deep enough, it's like we're going to recruit teams of astronauts who are less susceptible to emotional isolation. And there are such people, but everyone's on a spectrum, but the people who are less susceptible certainly are not completely they will be affected to a degree. And then those people typically don't make good teammates with other people, so it wouldn't be a good crew. So we realized there was a big problem that seemed to be completely impossible to solve, and that's where he started thinking about the problem. And he lives up in Scotland. He does like climbing and walking and stuff, and he said that he was kind of walking in the hills and just started to think about it, and gradually came up with the idea of how, because we're all quite plastic in the way we communicate as human beings, that actually if you could leverage the plasticity, if you like, to find a way that it made it feel to people at either end as if they're in a real-time conversation, even if they weren't, that it might be possible to sort of solve the problem. And he came up with the original concept of braiding, which is multiple threads of conversation kind of intertwined and presented to people in a different way so that it feels natural. And when he first sort of told me this idea, it like literally told me, and my brain kind of exploded. First thing I said was, that is absolute genius. And it was only later that Drew told me, I was the first person to get it immediately, probably because I've got the astrophysics background and because I've got a bit of mental health care background, etc. But it just absolutely made sense. I said, that's fantastic. That's genius, And he was like, oh, really? It's amazing. So that was where he first told me about it. And pretty much in that first meeting, the original, there wasn't a design of it. It was just a methodology, if you like. So I started to think about how might that look to people at either end, and the design we now have that delivers this to people, which is a carousel which carries multiple threads of conversation carefully timed. I kind of scribbled that on a piece of paper in that first time we chatted about it, and I've still got that piece of paper. So one day we'll put it on the wall in a frame or something. So that's how the idea came about from him telling me. Very quickly, I sort of started to say, these are some of the things about it. It was super exciting. And shortly after that, I ended up leaving the company, and pretty much the next phone call I got was Drew phoning me up and saying, would I join him as co-founder in a business to build braiding? It took me about 3 seconds to respond. Yes. So basically, that's where it all started from.
So I've obviously listened to you speak a few times now, and one of the things that still blows my mind is the relative scales, because although we've been talking, I guess, as a species about Mars for quite a long time, we're obviously a lot more familiar with perhaps the moon landings and obviously the ISS. So, for example, if I'm sitting on the International Space Station, which by my maths is about 400-500 kilometers up, what's the delay in a conversation if I'm there and you're on Earth?
Yeah, almost nothing, imperceptible. So you're right. The International Space Station orbits at about 400 kilometers. So if it goes directly over your head, if you're in, say, London, it's about as far away as Newcastle. And you can have a phone call with someone in Newcastle. You could have a Zoom with someone in Newcastle. It's easy to talk there. So the actual distance doesn't cause hardly any delay at all to the International Space Station. It's about 1/1000th of a second.
So let's go Mars distance then.
Tiny. Yeah, and then you get further and further. So the moon is a lot further, and at the moon it's like 1.3 seconds. So if you're talking to someone on the moon, and obviously the Apollo astronauts were on the moon in the late 60s, early 70s, and if you listen to the recording, it's perfectly possible to have a communication and a conversation with someone on the moon. Just need a little bit of discipline. You need to wait and be patient. So if I say something, I need to wait like 3 seconds for you to reply, and maybe I'll talk and say over, so it's your turn and I'm waiting then. So that's all okay. But then as you get beyond the moon, the distances get much, much further. So getting to the moon and back, the Apollo missions did it in kind of a couple of days, and that's because it's only about 400,000 kilometers away. Mars is many, many millions of kilometers away. The distance varies a lot as Mars and the Earth move around the sun in their different orbits. But at its very closest, the distance between the Earth and Mars is so big that it will take over 3 minutes for a signal to reach Mars. And at its furthest, when Earth is on one side of the sun and Mars is on the other, it's over 20 minutes. So it's something like, it's about 150 times further away than the moon at its very closest, and well over 1,000 times further away from the moon at its furthest. And somewhere along the way on that journey, as the crew travels further than the moon, voice conversation will cease to be possible.
See that, and that I think is when we first had that conversation, it's suddenly for me when most people are overawed by, I guess, that in the sense of the scale, the rocket, the concept of someone going away for 12 months, 15 months, however long it is. But actually, you're going that layer further and going, let's assume through the wonders of technology and everything else moving forwards that we solve, building a big enough rocket to get there and finding people that are happy to do it. Actually then looking at, let's now talk about the operational aspects, if you like, from a psycho and all the other things that come with it as well. And I think that's number one, that's fascinating to even be in that space. But number two, to go, there's nobody else on Earth that's figured this out. Kind of at what point from that meeting where you sat down and had that discussion and then the phone call I'm in through to something tangible, what was that journey like?
So yeah, there's a lot to it. And actually, before I jump into that, I'll just give you a slight aside, because you're right. That actually, there's this, the logistics of getting to Mars is just like bigger rockets, engineering, that kind of thing is stuff that humans are good at, right? We've done it over years. So the hardest part of getting a human mission to Mars is going to be looking after the human being, because they are the most complicated thing in those rockets. And there's actually three groups of hazards that will affect a human going to Mars. And this is what's particularly interesting, I think, about this thing we've done on the latency challenge. So the three groups of hazards are microgravity, because you're going to be basically in microgravity for most of your journey there and back. What does that do to your body? Your body evolved on Earth in a 1G environment. So that's different, right? There's also radiation. So you're going to be exposed to radiation from the sun and from cosmic rays that currently the atmosphere and the magnetic field of Earth protects you from on Earth. So those are two of the big risk factors. And those two risk factors actually are kind of easy to get your head around in some sense, because we've all seen films of real films from space stations or fictional films where astronauts float around. So conceptually, it makes sense to people that happens. So when you're having conversations on Earth that says, let's try and fix this, everyone kind of has got a feeling for it. It's the same with radiation. With radiation, everyone's familiar with radiation from nuclear power, from radiotherapy. If you've seen the aurora borealis or the aurora australis, they're actually caused by radiation from the sun hitting our atmosphere, so you can see radiation. So those two are kind of easy to get your head around. The isolation one, unless you've been isolated somewhere like in Antarctica or something, is hard to get your head around. And in particular, the latency part of it is really hard to get your head around, because we've all evolved over millions of years in zero latency. So unless you really think about it, it's very hard to get your head around. And along the way, I've met some very, very clever people from various space agencies and academic places and stuff. And actually, even people who understand the maths and the physics quite well. It's not until you sit down with them in a bit of paper and kind of map it out that this journey, this challenge becomes much more apparent, if you like. So that's one of the challenges is many people, even people in the space sector, don't realize quite what a big challenge latency is going to be. So in terms of that, to answer the actual question now, having sort of teed it up, in terms of that journey, it's been kind of interesting and challenging and all that sort of stuff in its own way. But we had this, the original concept that Drew had, and we created a way of making it real and effectively sort of demonstrating it, if you like. So we built a sort of I wouldn't even call it a demonstrator. It was almost a sort of a mock-up version. It didn't work, but it was kind of there. And we thought, what are we going to do with this now? And obviously, the people who are planning to go to Mars are NASA. We're over in the UK, so we've got to find a way to talk to NASA. And we had I suppose you make your own luck, but we had a very lucky break and a very strange break at that point in time. So I was I just happened to be looking on LinkedIn, and I stumbled across the profile of somebody. And I thought, this person looks interesting. I'd love to talk to them, because this person was it still is, in fact, professor of astrophysics at Rice University in Houston. And that's the university where back in the day, JFK did his send a man to the moon speech. So it's the hub of the space sector in Houston. This chap was the professor of astrophysics there. So I thought, well, I'm an astrophysicist, albeit nowhere near a professor. So maybe that's an angle to talk to this chap. Also, I found out he was Scottish, but now lives over in the States, and Drew's Scottish. We're a Scottish company. So I thought there's a couple of things here that are good angles. And then I found out, in the way LinkedIn works, that I was connected to someone who knew this person. So I reached out to her and I said, could you introduce me to him? Would he have a chat? Said, yeah, lovely guy. He loves helping people, especially Scottish companies. So I'm sure he'd talk to you. So we had this a sort of half-hour call with him. His name's Professor David Alexander. He's now one of our advisors. And we had this really weird conversation, because basically we said, we've solved this problem of high latency deep space communication. And his first response, which would have been mine until I'd seen the idea, was, you can't do that. There's laws of physics, speed of light. It's impossible. Stop wasting my time. So no. So we have. And we had this very strange half-hour conversation, because at that point we hadn't filed our patent application. So we couldn't talk about the idea. But we sort of said, look, we've solved it. And we had this half-hour conversation. And after about half an hour, he said, look, I don't know what you guys are on, he said, but I can tell you're smart enough to know if this is rubbish. So I think it's something. And I'm really curious to know what it is. He said, so you need to come to Houston to come to this conference called the International Space Medicine Summit. And this is back in 2019, just before the pandemic. So we're like, okay, well, at that point we were, self-funding this. We had no investment at all. We said, okay, well, we'll do it. This sounds worth it. Where do we buy tickets? Well, you can't buy tickets. It's an invitation-only conference. But I think what you've got, if you've got something, is potentially interesting enough that you can, we can arrange you an invitation. But he said, you sure as heck, when you get here, better be able to talk about it. So that was, a bit of a wow. And then we had to really accelerate. We were already in the process of filing a patent and everything. So that was, intellectual property. Everything was something we'd already started. We had to really accelerate that to make sure everything was registered and filed in time. We got on plane to Houston. We found the cheapest Airbnbs we could. So there was a hotel for the conference. We were nowhere near that. We were in the back of beyond in Houston, which is an interesting city. And we turn up and we meet David in a coffee shop in Rice University, and so we're a little bit, this is a professor of astrophysics. This is the guy who got us here. So we showed him our rough mock-up and said, this is it. And he kind of went quiet for a few seconds, and then he sort of looked at us both and he went, that just might work. And it was like, and that was kind of the big moment. That was kind of so then we went into the conference the next day, and we were basically, networking with people, getting to know people. We met a couple of a whole load of people. We met a whole load of amazing people. So I got to meet some former Apollo astronauts and all sorts of amazing stories around some of the people we met there. We met, perhaps the most important person we met there was a flight surgeon who's one of the current NASA flight surgeons. And we showed him the idea. And he'd already been doing a little bit of thinking about this, and he knew some academics who'd been working in this area. And he said, this is really exciting. He said he introduced us then to two academics who weren't at the conference, so they were just introduced afterwards. But they'd already done some research into when you have high latency in communication, how damaging is that? Not psychologically, actually, but operationally. What does it do to operational conversation? And their research paper, which had been NASA-funded project, essentially said, this is going to be a real challenge, right? This is really hard to handle when you have high latency, even in simple operational conversations. The whole conversation breaks down. So you need to find ways of doing it. And kind of the last line in their academic paper said, what we really need is some kind of technical or sort of communication solution to this. But of course, that's impossible because you can't break the speed of light. So when we later showed them this, they were like, that's the answer we were looking for. So those linkages allowed us to build relationships to the point where we were able to jointly apply for a NASA research grant when they asked for ideas, and we got some funding through Georgia Tech University, where one of these academics is based, to actually start a study on the tool that we've built to see if it works in the way we think it works. So It's quite a journey.
And I guess that was the thing that kind of blew my mind when you're talking about that, because existing in the world of entrepreneurs and things like that, I think it's relatively easy to be quite cynical of those sorts of things. If we've got this idea, it's going to be great, it's going to change the world. That moment when you're in that coffee shop and the professor says to you, this just might work, what did that feel like?
Yeah, it felt amazing, right? It absolutely felt amazing. It was fantastic. It was the first sort of external validation. This will sound a bit arrogant, right? But I would have been flabbergasted if he said anything else, because we knew it worked, right? We knew it was going to work because we'd spent so long thinking about it. No one else had, obviously, but we'd spent so long thinking about it. We'd mocked up stuff, we tested things, we could see the problem and we could see the solution. So it felt amazing, but in some way, it didn't feel surprising. It felt, it was what we expected. And I think from the conversation we had when we couldn't talk about the detail, but obviously, we had enough conversation that he could see that with Drew's psychology background, my astrophysics background, I've also run a few other businesses in the past and stuff, but that was irrelevant at that point in time. But he could see that we, as he said at the time, he could see that we weren't crazy, we weren't just making stuff up. He knew that there was something there, because that was his reason for inviting us, as it were, or for helping us to get there. So yeah, it felt amazing, but it didn't feel surprising. I don't know if that's arrogant or not. I hope not.
I don't think it is, because I think ultimately, if you're doing your job properly from a due diligence point of view, if you're confident and know your field, whatever field you're in, if you create something that does what it's supposed to do, then at the end of the day, you wouldn't be there standing telling people that it works if it didn't work. So the thing that I want to, step forwards a little bit. One of the things you mentioned earlier was about funding, and actually, you didn't have all of that support sort of thing. So going from, you've spoken to flight surgeons, you've spoken to academics, and they've agreed, right, you're onto something. What does the process look like for a company that doesn't have that backing to then go, right, well, to build this, we need X amount. And actually, we also need to generate some form of cash flow, because as you've alluded to, we're not going to Mars for a little while. So what does that look like, getting from that conference, almost up to where we are today?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of different things that you have to think about and do there. So first of all, from the very earliest days of me talking to Drew about it, and some of the first things people, friends and contacts have said, it's like, say, well, no one's going to Mars for 15 years. It's like, well, that's doesn't mean that there's no revenue for our company on the space side for 15 years. So, or no income, not necessarily revenue, but, so research happens all the time. So one of the things I'd love to find out, I don't know if anyone will ever help me find out, but I'm sure a whole bunch of spacesuits get made that never go into space. They get used in training and development and things like that, and preparation. So we know that as things evolve, there's going to be some work going on to go, well, let's find different ways of communicating. We're working, as I mentioned, in a grant that's funded by NASA through Georgia Tech. We're also working with the European Space Agency now and the UK Space Agency. So other space agencies are looking at these challenges of communication, how it evolves over time. This is relatively small, very small sums of money, but it's just, funds research, funds activity that helps us to further prove the value. And there's obviously some income there to the company that helps to defray some costs. So that's something that we knew from day one would be there, and we expect that to continue, for the next decade or so, and possibly gradually increase as people look into, personal preferences and different crews and how to use things. So that's one thing. But we also knew from day one two things: that that would be a really fascinating but small, probably smallish business. But we also thought a lot from day one about how what we were building could potentially be used on Earth. And this is where we've now got the beginnings of, literally a couple of weeks ago, actually went live, a product on Earth that's based on the same methodology. So the methodology, the way we created this way of interleaving conversations, was something that we realized from very early days could potentially be a tool to use on Earth. Now, with that, we were able to come up with some kinds of thinking about, well, what might that business look like? And again, we had a couple of helpful things there. So I said, the fact that Drew and I are so different in so many ways means that we're a good team, right? So stuff I can do, he can't do; stuff he can do, I can't do. And that's something that's quite powerful when you're looking to try to raise investment. So we started, as many companies do, we raised some money from friends and family, basically. So we started to do that. As I said, I've had a couple of businesses myself in the past. Going back like almost 20 years now, I started my first business. So I've already got experience of simple things like, how do you set up a company? How do you set up a company in such a way that it becomes an investable company? So that you've got, I mentioned earlier on the intellectual property. So the all of the rights in the design and the creation of braiding, it doesn't belong to me and it doesn't belong to Drew. It belongs to Braided Communications Limited. So if someone's investing in the company, they know that they're investing in a share of the stuff the company owns. Now that's fairly obvious when you say it like that, but it's amazing how few people know that up front. You have to learn that somewhere on the line. I learned it a long way away. So things like that all came together. So we started by, as I said, getting some friends, family, close contacts to actually invest, and we managed to get some money from that. Not much. We haven't raised much at all. And then along the way, we were introduced to a small venture capital company who also put in a little bit of money after a while. And of course, when we went through that stage, that's another step up in terms of kind of professionalism. So as a venture capital company, even though they put in a relatively small sum, they don't even put in a pound without everything being properly structured. So we went through all that process. It's kind of boring, but it's really, really important to get all that right. And that, so our friends and family kind of invested because they know me or they know Drew, or they quite like the idea of space. And also it wasn't, for some, if someone's got a few quid, they're lucky enough to have that, then can be an exciting and a good thing to do. A venture capital company invests because they see the potential in the future of the business, and that was on the space side, but also on the meeting side on Earth, which we've created now, which I can talk about in a bit more depth. I think some of the things around that were the fact that we had obviously we built something now for space, so to adapt it for Earth was relatively low cost and relatively low risk. So we already knew some of the pitfalls that we'd fallen into before and climbed out of, so we weren't going to fall into them when we built the version for Earth. As I said, things like the fact that my first business happened to be conference calls and web conferencing. So it was back in the early days of conference calls and web conferencing in the UK, collaboration services business. So the fact that I'd already been through that journey is again a sort of a beneficial thing when people think, well, this isn't a team that's never been out there trying to build a business from scratch. So a few things like that we knew were in our favor when we started to ask questions. Still wasn't easy, but it was possible.
I think what's really interesting, and I was just kind of thinking as you were talking there about the testing element of it, because actually it's not difficult at all. If you like to test a product like this, you just have to have a 20, 10, 15-minute delay on a conversation with people sitting in two rooms. So you can actually test, if you like, whether the product actually works relatively simply on Earth. But the thing that really fascinated me off what you just said there was the fact that you had a product that was effectively not designed for Earth, and that became where you went with it in terms of like in the short term. And that there are very few people I can think of that would even be able to describe having a product that they were like, we invented something to go to the moon with, and then we looked at where we were going to go next with it and decided Earth was probably the place we were going to settle with it. So has that been kind of a weird thing from a business point of view to kind of go, that's going to be our next focus as opposed to getting to Mars?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But actually, I'll just challenge you on the first thing about it's not that easy to test. So testing with people in different rooms, it's actually a bit, that we put a lot of work into that. So I can tell you about that maybe another day, right? Because there's a lot into that as well. It's really not as easy as it might sound to do that, but we've done that, and we've got a whole bunch of those tests going on, and we'll be doing more of them. But I've got a slide somewhere. Obviously all companies end up generating lots of slide decks and one pages and bits and pieces, and I've got a slide somewhere that says Earth is our second market, which is obviously very tongue-in-cheek, but it's kind of true. Literally, our first income as a company, our first external income has come from space agencies, and it's come from space agencies for doing research work into this capability, because potentially it might help them in their journeys in future. So very much the case that Earth is our second market. And interestingly, now that we have got this capability to help people on Earth, we're starting to do some networking and some reach outs, etc. So I was at an event in London a couple of days ago, kind of one of these business network events that is slowly starting to open up again face to face. And I was there to talk about our products for Earth, braided meetings. And I speak to a whole bunch of strangers. It's kind of interesting, and you have a chance to sort of try things out. And the first person I spoke to, I thought, I'm going to tell them the space side of the story very quickly and succinctly, and say, I said a little pitch, something our company does two things. First one sounds weird, but it's completely true. We built a tool for deep space communication for astronauts. And the second thing is how that can help you on Earth. And I was watching this person to see if they glazed over and went, this guy's crazy. But they were really interested. And it seems like, I thought that the universe of people or the population of people interested in the space side would be quite small. But it seems like everyone finds that quite an interesting story. Obviously, we don't go into depth, but the angle of saying this genuinely has been created to help people go to Mars in future, and now genuinely can help you in your business, seems to be a really interesting angle to people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think anyone who's got kids, asking them at 6, 7, 8 years old, what do you want to do when you grow up? I would say there's a large proportion of them that say, I want to be an astronaut, because it's something that captures your imagination. And you mentioned earlier about growing up, and actually I don't think most of us ever do. There's still the little child there that's captured by, and I think this is one of the things when you watch spectacles, whatever it is. I remember watching when Musk launched the Tesla and it opens up and there's the spaceman, and you might have no interest in space at all, but you watch that and you go, wow. In the same way that when you watch, I don't know, the opening ceremony at an Olympic Games, or very recently them discovering the endurance under Antarctica, it brings out that inner, I guess, child that's in you of anything's possible, and you could quite literally do anything. You don't have that inhibition. So that's kind of I guess a really interesting angle. And I think that's something that if I was a customer sitting on the other side of that conversation, I can think of very few people who would not want to have their mind kind of, I guess, hooked in by actually something that is fascinating, because I just think it makes sense.
Yeah, no, you 100% agree with you. I mean, the sort of like anything's possible. I'm still waiting for that call to become a professional footballer. I was never any good. I'm still no good, but I still play. So, I still think maybe one day. Absolutely agree with what you said there. I think the thing about you've got an interesting thing to talk about. That's great. But you've also, obviously, when you come to a business, you've got to be able to help someone do something better or solve a problem for them. If you can't do that, then there's kind of no point. So you've got to have something that's of value, because you can have a chat over coffee about going to Mars and spaceships, but you're never going to get the customer to buy something from you unless it helps them. So that's the thing. That's the sort of next big challenge for us, and that's what's been actually one of the really interesting parts of the journey about Drew and I being so different, because what we've built with this tool on Earth is a different way of having virtual meetings. And what we've found is that what it does is it kind of levels the playing fields in a particular way, which we think is going to be really valuable, which is the fact that everyone, I talked about earlier on about the astronauts and everyone being on a spectrum of kind of emotional dependence or not, and where people were trying to go with that, and how you could have a team of people who were less susceptible to emotional isolation, but they wouldn't make a good crew. That's one aspect of the way everyone's different. Another one is introverts and extroverts. So everyone is somewhere along the introvert and extrovert spectrum. And some people are very strongly at one end or the other, and some are in the middle, and that's fine. Everyone's somewhere there. But actually, when you think about a couple of key things about businesses today, particularly business meetings, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, are generally better for extroverts than they are for introverts, simply because of the way extroverts think and behave and introverts think and behave. And so an introvert in a meeting, the introverts in general, huge generalization here, so don't take this the wrong way, but introverts in general like to think more deeply before they say something. And quite often, if you are in a meeting and you're an introvert, you'll be just about to say something because you think you're comfortable now. And then one of those extroverts will have become uncomfortable with the silence. They will jump in and they will say something probably not thought through, because extroverts in general, huge generalization again, are talking as they're thinking. So what tends to happen is an introvert won't say anything because they would have been about to say something and they've been interrupted and they don't want to interrupt back. The extrovert will say something because they're silent and they feel uncomfortable, and they start talking, and you end up with the output of the meeting being a sort of like in simple terms, a half thought through idea from an extrovert rather than a fully thought through idea from an introvert. And at the end of the meeting, that's what was said. So that was the reality. So if you can find a way to sort of level the playing field, so in simple terms, the introverts have more opportunity and obligation to contribute, and the extroverts have less opportunity to interrupt and talk without thinking, then you've potentially got something that can be really, really valuable. And actually, we thought about this a long time ago, and within our company, I'm very much at the extrovert end of the scale. Drew's very much at the introvert end of the scale. So when we've thought about some of the meetings that he and I were in at the company we were at before, you only start to realize now just how much more valuable those meetings could have been if we were thinking along those lines about how to get the most out of everybody on the introvert extrovert spectrum. So that's where we're going with it now.
So let's explore that solution a little bit then. So for pretty much everyone out there over the last few years has become comfortable in some capacity with a virtual meeting, but it's probably exactly what you're talking about there, seen the challenges of it. I think of some of the group meetings that I had, certainly during lockdown 1, there might have been 40 people on the call and maybe 4 people were the ones doing the talking, even though it was a group meeting. So how does the solution, if you like, that you've gone to your second market with on Earth, how does that get over that?
So a great question. Actually, we didn't talk in huge detail about exactly how it looks for the astronauts, but I think I mentioned briefly that the messages are on a carousel. So it's a software delivered solution. So if you were on Mars and I was on Earth, we would both be logging in and looking at a screen which has kind of a carousel with multiple panels on it that rotates between us at a cadence that we can control as we wish, as it were. So it's a typed entry at the moment. So you would be typing about one thing on Mars. Maybe you're running the farm and you're telling me about how the tomatoes are growing. I'm typing about something on Earth, something about sports that I've been involved in. And then after, say, a couple of minutes, the carousel rotates one stop, and the content that you've been typing about tomatoes starts its journey to me, and the content I've been typing about sport starts its journey to you. And what we do is we configure it so that over a brief period of time, after a while, as the carousel rotates, you'll get fresh content from me every time it rotates, and I'll get fresh content from you. And that's how it feels like it's a natural conversation. So that's how it works with kind of a big latency and 2 people. On Earth, there's no latency. So you don't need to sort of take the time for those panels of content to travel and be in another one. So therefore, if you've got 4, 5, 6 panels on a carousel, you can have 4, 5, 6 people interacting simultaneously. So what we do is we create it like that. So there's, say, 5 topics. So one use case that's emerging quite strongly here is in technical development teams, where there's this approach called agile development, which is the modern way of developing software, where teams work in what they call a sprint cycle. So every 2 weeks, the team will develop a new iteration of the product, and then they'll share that with the customer, internal or external, and then they'll get feedback, and then they'll iterate again. And that's the way it works. And at the end of each sprint, these teams typically have what they call a retrospective meeting, where they're going, well, what was good last time? What did we miss out on? What could we do better next time? These retrospective meetings are a standard part of this. But because those development teams typically are dominated numerically by introverts, they don't talk much in those meetings. So you've got that dynamic I talked about before, where if there are a small number of people who are more extrovert than the others, they'll be the ones who talk most. That will be the output, which probably doesn't reflect what everyone thought. With braiding, each person is on a braid individually with their own time to think and add their thoughts without anybody else interrupting. Everyone's on a different braid at the same time. So you have more contribution in that everyone is simultaneously contributing, but there's, say, 5 topics. One of these retro sort of methods is called starfish. It's got 5 arms, so there's kind of 5 topics. That's one of the standard ways of doing it. So 5 people are on that meeting. Each of them is talking about a different topic, but on their own, and they can add their thoughts. And then it's only when the carousel rotates that those thoughts get taken to the next person around the carousel. And then that person can see the next topic. They can see what their colleagues have said, and they can go, well, what's my view on this? So each person gets to contribute independently without being interrupted. And I said, the benefit there for the introverts is they feel much more comfortable like that. They like to think, they like to talk like that. No one's going to interrupt them. For the extroverts, it feels a little bit weird because they're not able to talk continuously. But in terms of value of output for the meeting, that's an improvement, because actually that's what you want, is you want the extroverts to think more deeply and say something more valuable rather than talk to fill the silence. Huge generalizations there, but broadly, that's the way it works.
So in my head, I'm brainstorming on a wall at the same time that someone on the other side of the wall is brainstorming, and effectively nobody's interrupting each other. And I think that's something that for anyone who's sat in a meeting, or to be honest, even in social situations, you have those evenings where you're at a dinner party, and there's 8 people sitting around the table, and it's one person just talking nonstop. Yeah. And I can certainly, being at the extrovert end of the spectrum, appreciate how challenging that is, because that's something I think I've had to get a lot better at. And if you listen to episode 1 of the podcast versus up into the 70s where we are now, actually, it's a discussion that gets better because I've been more aware of that. That's taking 2-3 years. This would solve it in minutes, that problem. So I think from a value added point of view, obviously, depending on what industry you work in and how you do your meetings, especially for companies that are globally based, it's a fascinating kind of thing. So it must be quite an exciting place to be now, where you've kind of got the rubber stamp from the various space agencies to say, look, there's something in this and we're going to support looking into it further. But at the same time, you're kind of scratching the business itch of those experiences that you've had, and those 2 journeys are kind of happening concurrently.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exciting. It's hugely busy. It's hugely scary. The business one literally only a couple of weeks ago went live, so it's very early days for that. And in the meantime, the space stuff is still kind of taking time and keeping us excited. So yeah, it's been fantastic, but it's only the beginning of the journey, I think.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about reflections, because the story on its own is a wow. But I think, having been on that journey yourself, and obviously with the range of things that you've come across, let's talk problem solving, because obviously ultimately a product or anything that goes out there is effectively a solution to an issue that exists. So what have kind of been your views, if you like, or lessons that you've taken away from this problem solving journey that you've been on?
So that's a great question. Obviously, we could talk about that for a whole another hour, I think. But I think a couple of things is kind of understand your own strengths, and not you necessarily individually, but your team strengths. But never be kind of limited, if you like, by your weaknesses, because you can always learn and find other people to help with your weaknesses, if you like. So as I said, some of the things we had in our favor when we first started this journey is, I ran my own business before. Drew understands the psychology and the emotional impact of this in depth. I understood the maths and the physics in depth. Those were all great, actually. But when I think back then to when I started my first meeting, I'd never run a business before, but I did my planning and I did my thinking, and I talked to a lot of other people about how to run businesses, and I learned lessons. And actually, when I did that first business, I kind of did it deliberately to go and learn lessons about how to sell. I'd never been a salesperson before, for example. So as long as you're not kind of naive to your weaknesses, then you can be aware of them, and you can go out there and you go, I'm going to do things that might expose me to that, but they're going to help me learn along the way. And I'm going to make sure I've got people to support me as best I can along the way. And there is a lot of help out there. There's a lot of people, who are keen to help. So, personally, I've done mentoring over the years, and I know a lot of people who are keen to help and support younger people sort of being mentored. You mentioned, I think you mentioned before we started recording about the lecture I did recently to the University College London department. I know there was some kind of professors and postdocs on there, but there were some students as well. And those students were, some of them are looking at how do they get onto the entrepreneurial journey. And those people are, some of them reach out for help, and you should do that because you'll get help.
Well, that kind of dovetails, I guess, nicely into, I guess, the last bit of advice to pull this together. I did quite a lot of talks to students, and even with my hat on that I've got now, recently I spoke to a group of sports science students that were going on that journey into the wider world. And actually, if you'd have said to a sports psychology student, would you deem there being space in the space industry for the career path you're on now? And they probably never even joined the dots. And now, actually, if you think of an astronaut effectively as an athlete that needs a team around them, you're going to end up with effectively like a space support team like you would have for any other elite athlete. And actually the career paths for people going into space perhaps are a lot more open than they were maybe even 10 or 20 years ago. And it's conversations like this that perhaps kind of go from the drawing of I want to be an astronaut to actually, I'm now about to make a choice on career paths, and that's a viable one. So what's kind of your thoughts, having now been on that journey, about people that are potentially looking to get into the space industry?
You're 100% correct. I mean, first of all, it's that there's a lot more activity going on. There's a lot more recognition now about how space brings benefit on Earth as well. So, all the remote sensing from satellites that can help to understand things like warming of the oceans and all sorts of stuff like that. So there's much more of an industry around space rather than just space science, if you like. So that means there's much more opportunities. And I think that point, we talked about introvert, extroverting, inclusion, if you like. That point about inclusion is something that more and more people realize, and they don't realize and just talk about, they actually do now to a degree, which is you don't want, a team of people who are all the same with the same academic background trying to solve the same problem. You want people who've got different viewpoints. So if someone's got a sports science background, that could bring them a whole load of academic skills, but also a whole load of motivational skills that other people might lack. And I think there is much more openness to sort of people like that being encouraged and welcome to come into the space sector or parts of the space sector. If people want to explore those opportunities, I'd encourage them to do so. And that the UK actually published a space strategy late last year. And actually that talks about how we bring in people with different skills into the space sector, but it talked about the space sector very widely. It's all about how you take information from space and use it, how you add value into future missions or whatever it might be. There's a whole plethora of activities. Go out there and look, and you'll find it quite easily. That's another thing. It's all available. It's always easy to find these days. Much better than when I was young.
Yeah, and you say about looking, and I think I work not too far from in Hertfordshire from Stevenage, where a couple of the big space companies are based.
Absolutely.
And every time you drive down one of the dual carriageways, there's a huge sign up on one of the sides of the building saying "Home of the Mars Rover." And I think,
oh, is there? How cool!
Which is So and that is tangible. And I think if you go back 50, 60, 70 years to the various space activities through the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was on a screen. It might have been on your TV, but it certainly wasn't live streamed. I remember watching when Tim Peake was up in the ISS doing a live video call with a group of young kids back on Earth at a school, and you think, wow, that's really going to start the cogs whirring of actually young people potentially pursuing their dreams. So it's been absolutely fascinating. The second you told me when I was sitting on that train about what you did, I was already thinking I have to share this story. So it's really nice to kind of have pulled it together now to where we are now. And obviously we'll make sure, both with obviously the project itself as well as all these other things that are going on around it, we include the links to everything in there. And hopefully people can follow up and see the journey. That's going to be a very exciting one.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you this morning.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. And don't forget, we've got a back catalogue of content that goes all the way back to January 2020, including fighter pilots, Olympic champions, TV presenters, and inspiring authors. We'd really appreciate it if you can give us a quick rate and review, however you're joining us today. And if you don't want to miss out on any future episodes, make sure you hit subscribe. Our community update drops once a month, and we've got some great guest content being added, so be sure to sign up for that. And finally, we're all about inspiring and supporting as many people as possible. So if you can share this episode with one person that you think would enjoy it, that would be really, really cool. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Rogue Monkey Podcast.